Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our Human Behavior and Value Proposition webinar. My name is Kelly Kiedis Ogborn, and the goal of this presentation is to examine some basic tenets of human behavior and outline best practices you can adopt to present the value of your technology to each audience that you might encounter. If you are not familiar with our work, HS Draconis is a boutique consulting firm that specializes in technology commercialization and bridging the gap between various innovation ecosystems and markets. What that means is breaking down the barrier of entry to each sector and identifying opportunities for partnerships, capabilities adoption, and business growth. What we really strive for is to make each industry accessible and unravel the mystery of how each does business, whether that's through translating specific industry jargon so it's widely understood by broader and diverse audiences, or distilling the cultural factors that impact decision making. And our work applies to existing companies looking to expand into a new market, engineering firms or startups looking to develop their ideas, lone wolf inventors, or a project coming out of a research and development environment looking to grow and commercialize. In all of those scenarios, what it really comes down to is the human side of science and technology. And moreover, understanding that it's about more than your work and your product. It is critical to know who your audience is and how to communicate the impact of your work in a way and a language that will resonate with them. And that comes from understanding human behavior and motivational drivers. The webinar today will be broken down into 4 parts, and Kate and I will be switching off throughout the presentation. Our goal is for you to walk away with practical and applicable knowledge about human interactions, and we'll also supply you with some tools and exercises that you can use to aid in your engagements. So let's dive straight in. As I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of our work focuses on bridging the gap between innovation ecosystems and bringing the worlds of science and business together. And for science-minded individuals and those in the R&D community, I think it's critically important for them to start thinking about their work in a broader context, especially when it comes to selling their idea or building out a business. And the way that I like to illustrate this concept is through the juxtaposition of the 2 gentlemen that you see on the screen. On the left-hand side is my science-minded example or individual with Richard Feynman, who was a popular American theoretical physicist in the 1950s and 60s. Feynman gained a lot of notoriety not only for his scientific ability, but he also had the gift of the gab, which made him fairly unique in the field. He is credited with pioneering quantum computing and introducing the concept of nanotechnology. And he also worked on the Manhattan Project during World War II. In one of his more famous quotes, he says, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." If any of you have ever heard the expression, "you cannot explain your way out of a paper bag," the same concept applies here. Even with the greatest of storytelling, when dealing with tangible physical means or products, they either are or they aren't. A great recent example of this is the company Theranos with its founder, Elizabeth Holmes. Externally, Theranos was set to fundamentally change the landscape of blood tests. They were getting tons of media coverage, and she was being hailed as the next Steve Jobs. However, privately, their technology was a complete disaster. It couldn't do what they claimed it could, and eventually it caught up with them because they were not able to deliver on what they promised. This is truly an example of putting the cart before the horse and trying to lead with emotion and what could be, and not being able to back it up with science. Now let's compare this to my business example of Dale Carnegie. For those of you who are not familiar with Mr. Carnegie, he was an American writer and lecturer, and some of his famous books include How to Win Friends and Influence People and The Art of Public Speaking. And he also created numerous teaching courses in self-improvement, interpersonal skills, salesmanship, corporate trainings, and the rise of the modern day salesman and the personality traits associated with it are actually traced back to him. In one of his more famous quotes, he says, "When dealing with people, remember that you are not dealing with creatures of logic, but creatures of emotion." Now let's think about both of these for a second. How different each of these quotes are, but also how they are both correct. For Feynman, and for those in the technical world, reality absolutely needs to take precedence over public relations or selling, because at the end of the day, the technology has to actually work. But for Carnegie, and for those in the non-technical business world, reality, or a working technology, doesn't convince people to buy, Emotion does. And there is a far more powerful tool than emotion. It's called motive. There is a reason behind everything and every action. And when you understand that concept and begin to understand people, selling to them becomes a lot easier. In my opinion, I don't think there's enough stock placed in the gray area intangibles of relationships, and that is precisely where we aim to move the needle towards today. Because for a successful strategy, there needs to be a middle ground between both camps. One person who does this really well is Neil deGrasse Tyson. He demonstrates ownership of knowledge and not just an awareness of the facts, and he can take a terminology and tell a story from it. From a language perspective, it's very interesting because he makes his message accessible while also maintaining his scientific credibility. And he has a tendency to use a technical term and then explain what it means to bring people up to his level. The bottom line is that he appeals to their sense of wonder and then he backs it up with facts. He then explains those facts in a way that doesn't make anyone feel inferior or less than for not understanding the scientific jargon, because what he's really striving to do is make science accessible for everyone, and he's been very successful at that. And the reason that this is important is because within innovation, there are two truths. There's the scientific truth, and there's the political truth. And by political truths, I do not mean actual policies and laws passed by the government, although there are many cases that applies. But here I'm talking about those gray area intangible elements that drive decisions forward. Both have to be incorporated into a winning strategy because there is no shortage of demand for innovation, but what there is a shortage of is knowledge. And it's knowledge of the proper steps that someone must take to create a space for science and technology to thrive. In your journey of building your business, there are going to be many components that play a key role in your success. But more often than not, your biggest driving force is going to be people. It'll be people and their influence to push your idea over the top, whether it be through policy implementation, connections, advocacy, funding, market knowledge, or simply word of mouth. The biggest challenge, though, is getting those people to the table and on your side. And the best way to do that is to start by understanding how human evolution affected our brains. It was survival, not knowledge, that drove the evolution of the human brain. Early on, survival meant being able to anticipate and assess danger and make a good decision about how to respond to it. What that also meant was strength in numbers. Those who were successful knew how to be accepted within a community and adapt appropriately to its cultural norms. Since society began, therefore, people have had to decide when to share what might be seen as a crazy or outlandish idea and when to conform. Now, fortunately for us in modern times, we don't face the same types of threats as wilderness beasts and poisonous berries, but our survival instincts are still at work and our brains have remained relatively the same. Our brains evolved to protect our worldview, and we naturally default to the norm and seek out what is expected to maintain our status quo. What that means is that when a new concept or idea is introduced that challenges what we thought we knew, our brain's response is to go on the defensive, even if what is being introduced is factually accurate. An extreme example of this are the flat earthers, who insist upon a reality of the world being flat, even though every scientific experiment they've conducted has proven them wrong. But their response is that they must be conducting the experiments incorrectly. And what this boils down to is that what seems strange from an intellectualist point of view can be shrewd from a social interactionist point of view, and that arguments backed by social and societal motivations are much more likely to take hold. In other words, logic doesn't convince people to buy, emotion does. I'm going to say that again. Logic doesn't convince people to buy, emotion does, which takes me to my next two main points. Perception is extremely powerful, and anything new is unfortunately perceived as dangerous by our brains. All technical innovations are met with fear initially, especially radical, meaning revolutionary ones. And this is in large part because those who are introducing these ideas are not effectively using what they know about people. Most of the time, they start by stating the facts. That is generally what everybody does. But when you lead with just information, you put up a barrier between yourself and others, even if you don't mean to. And instinctually, people just don't like what they don't understand. So to overcome that emotional barrier, what you need to do is understand the drivers within the community you are trying to reach and then tailor your message to those values. Understanding this will help you pinpoint the skepticism and fear in them, even when it's masked as something else, as it often is, and will allow you to employ tactics to get around it rather than be frustrated and think that you've hit the end of the line. Two things that you can do immediately are, you can first start by telling them a story. There's a really interesting neurological phenomena that occurs in your brain when you hear a story. If you are just presented with facts and data, our brains work to decode those words into meaning. But when you are told a story, your brain decodes the words into meaning, but it also activates the motor cortex to go through the motions of the story, which imprints that on your brain the same way a memory would. The experience serves to enhance the memory of the listener, and it also makes sure that your message sticks with them. Another thing you can do is replace their fear with curiosity and excitement before you impart your knowledge and facts. You want to paint a picture of what the world can be. You want to get them excited about it, because once you get them interested, you can create the space for your discovery, because that is how ideas truly survive. Because you capture people with emotion, and then you captivate them with information.
All right, thank you, Kelly. I'm gonna step in now. My name is Kate Lucy, and I'm gonna kind of take all of those concepts that Kelly laid out and help you figure out how to translate them into actual tactics, specifically around how you use language to talk about your work. One of the things that we hear all the time is that people struggle with knowing what to do when it comes down to getting the pen to paper when the rubber meets the road. What am I actually supposed to do differently? So that's what this is going to be about. Part 2 is specifically focused on which words you can change to make this impact and to make those concepts work for you. So it starts with a basic understanding of some of the key pitfalls, especially within the scientific community, but this is really something that is prevalent in any area where you have expertise and other people you're speaking with might not have the same level of expertise. We work a lot with scientists, but it is certainly not limited just to them. The first one, surprise, surprise, acronyms. We hear this all the time in pretty much every single context of a community that is created around specific ideas and shared knowledge. It's efficient to build in acronyms to be able to make your points more quickly. And acronyms, though, create an in-group and an out-group scenario. If you don't know what that acronym means, then you don't have the ability to follow along with the rest of the story. So when you're talking to people or when you're doing any form of writing, be on the lookout for falling into any of those patterns, and just be aware of writing them out at least the first time, or reminding people throughout something that what that acronym is referencing. Another thing that's very similar to acronyms is the concept of technical terminology and jargon. And these are terms that live specifically within the realm of whatever you're talking about. And you see that in all sorts of areas of expertise, but if there's something that's a word that only applies to you in your world as a biophysicist or a chemist, then you want to make sure that you really give people insight into what those terms mean and how they relate to the larger story you're telling. Another thing that we see more commonly than we actually might be aware of is this notion of special uses of common words. So that is when a word that is part of perhaps more of the general vernacular has a specific technical meaning. And one of the ones that we've seen recently was working with a scientist who used the word exploit in terms of particle separation, optical particle separation. And when we were doing the review of his proposal, we said, well, the word exploit seems to be a little bit strong, has a negative connotation. Is there a different word that we can use there? And he said, no, really in this context, it has a specific meaning here that is technically salient. And that was a learning experience for all of us. But if you start to notice that there are words like that within your realm, you want to make sure that you highlight and point that out, because that person will be assigning their knowledge of what that word means as opposed to the technical one. The last thing that is important is to recognize that one of the most efficient ways that we use to cut down on the time it takes to share our message is a phrase or a word that stands for something much larger, like a process, a procedure, or a protocol. And when that happens, you can realize that what you're ended up doing is eliminating an entire series of information or exchanges of information and replacing it with a single word. The example I like to use in this context is in cooking. Talk about dicing an onion. That word dice can actually be broken down into all sorts of different steps of what you're supposed to do physically to get from a whole onion to this result of smaller cubes of onions. And if you aren't aware of what the potential weight of that word might be, then you'll lose people along the way. So these are 4 great things, especially if you are in the process of writing something, whether it's a presentation or a proposal, to go through after you write something and search for these different categories of words within your language and make sure that you've done what you need to do to bring everyone along with you on that process. Now, another thing that we experience a lot when talking to people is, and I'm sure everyone has had this before, where you are excited about something because it's a big deal to you because you understand the background of whatever it is that you're talking about. You have that expertise. And when you try to share that excitement with someone else, they kind of give you the deer in headlights sort of look. They don't understand what it is that is so impactful about what you're talking about. And one of the things that I think can explain that is this notion of the art of the possible. So if the person you're talking to has no idea that the world could be any different or better than it already is with regards to whatever you're talking about, it's going to be incredibly difficult for them to get excited about what you want to share. And Kelly talked earlier about sharing things with people in a way that replaces fear with curiosity and excitement. I think another thing that you want to keep in mind is that it's not always fear. It sometimes is resignation, apathy to what is the status quo. And if someone has no concept or ability to visualize what is possible or what the future could look like, then they're not going to be able to come with you on that journey and find that curiosity and excitement. The example we use with this is Henry Ford and the automobile. He has a famous quote where he says, you know, if I had asked people what they wanted when I was building the automobile, they would have said a faster horse. And what he's talking about here is exactly this point of, I see something that is novel and new and is pushing the boundaries, is truly radical and revolutionary, but I need to make sure that I'm giving people the tools to be able to create that vision in their own heads. Otherwise, they're not going to understand the impact of what it is that you're trying to share. The last thing to do, and this gets back to our changing of our language, right, is making sure that you show your work. Oftentimes, especially people with high levels of expertise, they don't want to necessarily have to go back and explain the basics because, and it's not because they don't care or they don't think it's important or they don't want to have to take the time. It's because it's just not something that they think about every day. They live and exist in a different plane than others who are new to what their field is about. But when you're trying to engage people who are new, you do need to go back to the basics. And it kind of does go back to what Kelly was saying too with Neil deGrasse Tyson. He takes the time to walk people through his work, the processes, the terminology, the connections between those processes and ideas and the real world so that they can follow the story. And even though when you're working with someone who's a peer or a colleague, you don't have to do that. You can do the work in your head, quote unquote. You need to make sure that when you're engaging new people, you give them the opportunity to see those thought processes and work it all through. So for those, as a review, those are just 3 quick rules to follow, especially when it comes to looking at something that you need to tweak and change. Write it out, and then make sure that you have clearly articulated any of your technical terminology, that you've made any connections for people who need to make an ideological leap, and that you've done that by walking them through each of those ideas and processes and making the connections. Now, the next piece of this, why are we doing that? The point is that, to Kelly's point, motivation and human connections are the ways that we really end up engaging successfully with others and sharing our work with a broader audience. And all that comes down to creating a value proposition. People need to know the so what. They need to know, why should I, as an individual or as a person within a community, care about this work that you're doing that might seem a little bit esoteric? And that really breaks down to a few different things. And it starts first with understanding who that person is that you're talking to. So on your screen, you'll see what we call a persona canvas. We're going to walk through the one that you do to fill it out for your customer. We also have downloadable versions of ones that you can do for yourself, because it's all about understanding who you are as a human and who they are as a human, and where those connections might take place. So first thing you're going to ask is, well, who am I talking to in terms of an organization? What are the structures that are within it? How big are they? How do they fit into this industry? Then you're also going to, I have to emphasize this a lot, you are always talking to an individual. You're not talking to that company. You're talking to someone within that company. So make sure that you drill down to the person that you're going to be engaging and who it is that they are within that structure. Then the rest of this is really going to stay focused on that individual. You're going to be thinking about them as a person, because the only way that you can really engage with someone on a human level is to treat them as a human, and you can empathize with or engage with a company as an organizational structure. So what are their goals? What are their values? What are the challenges that are keeping them up at night? What are the things that they are experiencing as roadblocks? And you don't necessarily at this stage want to think about just the things that you can solve. You want to understand broadly what they're experiencing. This might seem silly, but you always also need to remember that this person is a human outside of their work. If there is the opportunity for you to learn more about who they are as an individual, that can be really useful in terms of gaining trust, respect, and just a general relationship with that individual. Then the last thing that you'll really consider about this person is how they make decisions. And this is one thing that often is overlooked because it seems so basic. But if you don't know what it is that this person goes through in terms of whether they need to get buy-in from others in their organization, whether they have the power to make these decisions, whether they prefer hearing a story or prefer seeing data, all of those things will make it more or less difficult for you to engage with them. And if you can learn more about their process and what they need from you to be able to make a choice, then you're going to get to a decision much more quickly. Last, and only after you've done all this other consideration, is when you look at this canvas and you'll say, well, where is the potential opportunity here? Where is the connection that I can make? And if you're struggling with that, we do recommend that you go and you get the persona canvas for yourself as well, which will help break down your value, your opportunities in a very similar way that will really complement this experience with your customer. Now, I'm not going to walk through all of this really quickly, but you can see here we created a persona canvas for a company that builds spacesuits and started filling in all of the different boxes of this persona canvas. And as you start to unfold and peel back the layers of what this person is going through, what their challenges are, then that's when you also start to see these opportunities here. So practice this with the people in your life, the people that you work with, and start to understand how you can take a human who seems so complex and kind of intractable and break it down into parts that can help you figure out what that value proposition starts with. From there, once you've made that connection, we have to go back to, well, what is a value proposition? It really breaks down to connecting a customer's need or potential benefit to the solution you provide that also gives them a window into why your solution is better than any of the other ones on the market. And that seems pretty basic, but it can get more complicated because you also have to try and do it quickly. And so this is where we have some advice for you, right? In terms of understanding customer needs and benefits, you want to make sure that you get down to the specifics of what the real challenges are, not just on a general level, but in a day-to-day specific sense. That also is going to give you an ability to measure those results, because you'll understand how to quantify their challenges and your solution, right? Then you can bring it to your solution and identify what it is that you're going to be able to resolve or improve. And you can't do any of that without acknowledging that most likely you are not the only person working on this problem. If that's true, then what you're dealing with is probably that problem of the art of the possible that we talked about before. But who really is your competition, and what is it that makes you different? You need to make sure that that is something that you can clearly share, and that you can also give them the opportunity to test out and measure. This is all about building trust and building a sense of connection, that this person can understand this narrative here and then test it out. Now, a great value proposition needs to include those 3 data points, but in terms of how it's constructed, it can look very different depending on who you're talking to. All of them, however, have a few common elements. It needs to be clear and short and to the point, right? It needs to explain how you're different from what else is out there. It needs to have specific measurable outcomes that you can point to and that your client or potential client can measure. And then it needs to be simple enough that they can repeat it. And this is one thing that I think we often miss. Every time you're talking to someone about a value proposition, it's an opportunity to get them to do some of the work for you. Kelly and I often talk with folks about how the first conversation probably isn't going to be the conversation that makes a relationship. You're going to need to share that story with a number of different people. If the first person you talk to, however, is able to understand and repeat your value proposition for you, then they can become an advocate who's going out and doing that work for you and sharing your story. So between these 2 slides, we want to be able to have these elements from a content standpoint and these elements from a format standpoint. Now, you're sitting here saying, well, how do I put that all together? This is where we talk about telling your story. This is an example that Kelly mentioned early on as a way of really engaging people, and we found it to be really effective. Here's a 5-step process that you can follow, figure out how these elements work for your story, and try it out. It begins with understanding where the beginning of your story is. This goes back to everything we talked about in part 2, as well as looking at that persona canvas. If you don't have a good sense of where your client, potential client, is coming from, where they're anchored in the world, what their beliefs are, what their knowledge base is, then it's going to be much harder for you to make that connection. So start before you even think about yourself, thinking about them and your relationship, and how far back you need to go, how you need to frame this story to make it effective. From there, we get really into the big heart of the value proposition, which is being able to clearly state the problem, being able to succinctly describe your solution, and then being able to back up your solution with some of the specific tactics and science, if it applies there, that you can describe. From there, you bring it back to the human again by saying, well, why does this matter? Why should they care? What in the world is going to change from this experience? And so we put these first and last elements in boxes there, because these are the parts that are about the client, that are about the human. And then the middle part is the part where you connect it to what it is that you do. 5 steps, 5 elements, 1 story, and a value proposition that you can create, recreate, and mold to the person that you're talking to.
Thank you, Kate. This last section is to give you some tips to further your engagement strategy, whether that be interacting with people at a networking event or conducting phone calls or emails for work. Essentially, anytime you're engaging with another person, these can come in handy. Now, one thing to consider is that ultimately, every strategy needs to work for the person implementing it. So please take these as suggestions and think about how you can use them to enhance what it is you're already doing. To begin to frame this discussion, I'd like to start by talking a bit about the difference of being persistent versus being pesky. I think that most people can relate to an instance where you make a great connection with someone and then you follow up and you hear nothing. This can be a very tricky situation to navigate because you really want to further this interaction, but you also don't want to come across as a nuisance. So, how do you walk that fine line? Now, the unfortunate truth is that sometimes there will be no follow up on the other end. You simply just got sold a false bill of goods. However, below are some tips to help you create the best impression and to cultivate a long lasting relationship after you've had your initial interaction. So, the first is to understand that the onus is on you. If you are in the position of wanting to further the relationship and potentially collaborate with this person, you need to make the first move to continue the dialogue in a new forum. When you do create that first connection after you meet, make sure to remind them of who you are, where you met, and what you discussed. This is an extremely important step, especially after a busy networking event or conference, because chances are they met multiple people and had many similar conversations. Helping to jog their memory up front is a considerate way to restart the conversation and not force them into an uncomfortable position of trying to remember who you are in the unfortunate event that they forgot. The second is that if you do send an email, be very specific in your subject line. That space should be used to communicate what the ask is. Do you want to go to lunch with them? Would you perhaps like them to look over your resume? Whatever it is, be specific to save that person time and to give them an expectation of what the email entails. People prioritize emails just as they do tasks, and letting them know what the subject is about allows them to rank the level of importance. If you just wrote something generic like hello, they might think it's spam and it might drop to the bottom of their to-do list, and chances are you might not hear back for a couple of weeks. The third is to be open about what you are hoping to achieve, because that helps manage expectations on both ends. Most people will shy away from this step because they don't potentially want to hear the words no, but no can be very powerful because it allows them the opportunity to recommend you to someone who can help you, and it can also save you time and effort spinning your wheels toward a potential dead end. And lastly, is that you never want to leave the guesswork up to them. Be clear in your communication of suggested next steps and what you hope to achieve from them. Ambiguity never served anyone well, and this is especially true in business. What I'm going to go over now are some tips of the trade specifically for networking and how to make the most of it to ensure it's as comfortable and enjoyable of an experience as possible. And these tips are to do your research, to have a goal, to know your audience and dress accordingly, to be open to new paths, and to not approach it as transactional. Your ultimate goal is to establish long-term relationships. I'll now explain each a bit in depth. Do your research. If possible, prior to the event, try to find a guest list to know who will be in attendance so that you can prepare what it is you want to say to them. This will not only help you perfect your elevator pitch, but it'll also lessen the feeling that you're walking into a room full of strangers. Instead, it can feel more like a bunch of warm leads because you already know a bit about their backstory. The next is to have a goal. Ultimately, what you want to do is to approach networking like you would a project. You want to go in with an objective of what it is you're hoping to achieve. Do you have a laser focus on a particular person that you want to meet? Or are you hoping to find 5 new clients? Or maybe you're just there for the free snacks and drinks. Understanding your objective will allow you to maximize your time instead of aimlessly wandering around. It'll also help you prioritize if the networking event is even worth attending. I'm sure that all of you can relate to what I'm about to say in that any given industry, there are hundreds of events that happen monthly, and being able to understand what you hope to gain from them will allow you to pick and choose which will even be the most beneficial for your time. You want to know your audience and dress accordingly. Every industry has an unspoken dress code. The tech industry and the corporate worlds are vastly different. Knowing your audience, and this means who the event host is and the guest list, will help you dress accordingly to prevent you from looking like you don't belong. If you're unsure, a pro tip that I like to use is to err on the side of formality but use layering on my side. If you arrive and realize that it's less formal than you anticipated, it's extremely easy to take off a blazer or a tie to create a more casual look. Layering just gives you many more options if you're going into an event that's unknown. The fourth and my favorite is to be open to new paths. This dovetails nicely from not being afraid to hear no that I mentioned earlier in persistent versus pesky. Sometimes the ideal person to engage with is not who you originally thought it would be. As you are having conversations with individuals, you should be open to them suggesting that you talk to someone else. Now, this is not a representation of them wanting to get rid of you, but everyone is limited by their own knowledge, and there's often a reason why you're being referred to talk to someone else. It's because your original person knows that the other person is the correct one who can help you. If you do get introduced to someone new and it's not immediately obvious as to why, do not panic. Rather, be open to the conversation and share the same information that you prepared to talk to the first person about. This should help jumpstart your engagement. And lastly, is that you don't want to approach it as transactional. If I said the word used car salesman, it automatically conjures up a particular image in your mind. You do not want to be that person. Rather, you'll be much more successful if you treat these relationships less like business partnerships and more like friendships. As you continue throughout your career, you're never going to know where opportunities will arise. And it's much better and easier to grow when you have a robust network around you. Engage with interesting people for the sake of simply having interesting conversations, because this will not only help open your aperture to new ways of thinking, but it will also inject creativity into your work. And that concludes today's webinar. We want to thank you again for spending your time with us, and we hope that the information will be helpful to further your engagements and your business development efforts. If you have any questions or would like to interact with us further, please send us an email. Our addresses are below, and we'd love to connect with you. Thanks again.